So the saga of Joe Rogan continues. We are now on day number 746 straight of continuing to talk about Joe Rogan. He's dominating the national dialogue to the point where, you know, people in my life who aren't really politically involved and aren't really online too much are texting me about it. My mom texted me something about what's going on with Joe Rogan. So in order to give you the new update, which, by the way, includes yours truly very directly, let me go ahead and yet again rehash the backstory so you can see how we got to where we are now. So it all started when Joe Rogan had on Dr. Malone and Dr. McCullough. These are two anti-vaccine doctors who, listen, I'm no fan of them at all. And I actually think it's fair to say they spread vaccine misinformation. They take, you know, little bits and pieces of data that are cherry-picked to try to build a case that the vaccine is at least very questionable when the overwhelming bulk of the data and the evidence is on the other side of that argument. And I don't know what the exact number is, but probably 95% or 99% of doctors and scientists say, look, it's safe and effective and you should get the vaccine. There was this study that came out of France, over 20 million people, and they found that the vaccine reduces severe illness, hospitalization, and death with COVID by over 90%. So, I mean, that's the broad strokes. That's not to say there aren't some terrible side effects in some people with the vaccine, but that doesn't mean you can just write off the vaccine wholly because the amount of good it's done is way outweighed by the amount of bad it's done. So, Malone and McCullough went on the podcast, and as a result of that, you know, mainstream media covered that, and they were apoplectic over it. I wish what the media did was, instead of sort of throwing up their hands and trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater and sort of prod Spotify to axe Joe, I just wish they went claim for claim with Malone and McCullough and said, look, here's where he's wrong and where they're wrong. Now, there are tiny points where they're right. Okay, point that out, but here's why overall they're wrong. That would have been preferable. Unfortunately, very few people did that. Breaking Points had on a doctor by the name of, I forget his name, Dr. Prasad, something like that, and he did a great job going point for point. There was one other YouTube doctor who did a great job rebutting some of the arguments of Malone and McCullough, but that should be what mainstream media is doing. Instead, they're not doing that at all. They're doing a broader culture war conversation. So Neil Young, the musician, steps up and says to Spotify, it's me or Rogan. You know, I don't agree with what Rogan is spreading on your platform, so either get rid of, either I'll step down and I don't want my stuff on your platform, or you get rid of Rogan. That's not really a difficult decision for Spotify, at least not at the time, because Joe Rogan is the number one podcast in the world by a mile and a half. So the reaction was, all right, Neil, we're getting your stuff off of Spotify. Joe came out and responded to Neil Young fleeing, also Joni Mitchell fleeing. And Joe basically said, look, I have a problem with the term misinformation because a lot of the stuff that we thought was factual scientific information at the beginning of the pandemic now turns out to be misinformation. So basically, like, who's really to decide what is and isn't misinformation? So part of what he said was sort of, get off my ass, I'm trying my best. And then the other part of what he said was, listen, I'll try to balance things out. And if I have a controversial vaccine opinion person on the next episode, I'll try to bring on a pro-vaccine person on, and we'll balance it out. And also, I will try to prepare more, so I'm prepared for almost any claim that can come up if it's controversial to try to rebut it. So it was like a half apology and a half, you guys need to not be so definitive with this idea of misinformation because the information has evolved over time and we all need to acknowledge that. Well, that wasn't enough to satiate the crowd. And so you also had Crosby, Stills, and Nash pull out, and Bruce Springsteen's guitarist pull out of Spotify, and India Ari, I think music producer is what she is, she pulled out. And, you know, you had Spotify, the company, losing a tremendous amount of money in market share. And so here's where the real, you know, tipping point comes. There's a Democratic super PAC by the name of Midas Touch, and they released a supercut, a long compilation video of Joe saying the N-word, I think 22 times. And Joe Rogan saw this, was mortified, and then he released this video.
I'm making this video to talk about the most regretful and shameful thing that I've ever had to talk about publicly. There's a video that's out that's a compilation of me saying the N-word. It's a video that's made of clips taken out of context of me of 12 years of conversations on my podcast, and it's all smushed together, and it looks fucking horrible, even to me. Now, I know that to most people, there's no context where a white person is ever allowed to say that word, never mind publicly on a podcast. And I agree with that now. I haven't said it in years, but for a long time, when I would bring that word up, like if it would come up in conversation, instead of saying the N-word, I would just say the word. I thought as long as it was in context, people would understand what I was doing. Like that context was part of the clip we were talking about Red Fox, how Red Fox said that word on television in the 1970s, and how times have changed so much since then. Or about how Richard Pryor used it as one of the titles of one of his albums. Or I was quoting a Lenny Bruce bit, or I was quoting a Paul Mooney bit, or I was talking about how Quentin Tarantino used it repeatedly in Pulp Fiction. Or I was talking about how a Netflix executive, ironically, used it because he was trying to compare it to another offensive word, and he said it out loud, and they fired him. Not calling anybody or just saying the word out loud. I was also talking about how there's not another word like it in the entire English language, because it's a word where only one group of people is allowed to use it, and they can use it in so many different ways. Like if a white person says that word, it's racist and toxic, but a black person can use it, and it could be a punchline, it could be a term of endearment, it could be lyrics to a rap song, it could be a positive affirmation. It's a very unusual word, but it's not my word to use. I'm well aware of that now, but for years I used it in that manner. I never used it to be racist because I'm not racist, but whenever you're in a situation where you have to say, I'm not racist, you fucked up. And I clearly have fucked up. And that's my intention to express myself in this video, to say, there's nothing I can do to take that back. I wish I could. Obviously, that's not possible. I do hope that, if anything, that this can be a teachable moment. Because I never thought it would ever be taken out of context and put in a video like that. And now that it is, holy shit, it looks bad. And there's another clip that I have to address. There's a clip from 11 years ago. I was telling a story on the podcast about how me and my friend Tommy and his girlfriend, we got really high. We were in Philadelphia, and we went to go see Planet of the Apes. And we didn't know where we were going. We just got dropped off by a cab, and we got dropped off in this all-black neighborhood. And I was trying to make the story entertaining, and I said we got out, and it was like we were in Africa. It's like we were in Planet of the Apes. I did not, nor would I ever say that black people are apes, but it sure fucking sounded like that. And I immediately afterwards said, that's a racist thing to say. Planet of the Apes wasn't even in Africa. I was just saying there's a lot of black people there. But then I went on to talk about what a positive experience it was and how much fun it was to go to see this movie in a black neighborhood. It wasn't a racist story, but it sounded terrible. And like I said, you can have clunky stories about anything, but not about race. And so I deleted that whole podcast, but obviously somebody made a clip out of it and taken out of context. It looks terrible, but it looks terrible even in context. It's a fucking idiotic thing to say. And I was just trying to be entertaining. I certainly wasn't trying to be racist. And I certainly would never want to offend someone for entertainment with something as stupid as racism. My apologies and much love. My sincere, deepest apologies and much love.
When covering stories about hate crimes, I had the exact same policy where if you're reading a quote of somebody engaged in a hate crime and the quote says, hey, get on the ground, N-word, the policy on this show was to say the actual word so as to not sanitize the situation. So in other words, you're using the word in the context of saying, hey, the word is really bad, and here's how racist the person was who said it. Now, that's not just me who had that policy. It's also the Young Turks. In response to what happened with Joe here, people released a supercut of the Young Turks saying the N-word over and over and over and over and over. And Anna Kasparian came out and tweeted, look, we had a policy of, in the context of a story, if there's a literal quote in the story that says the word, so as to not sanitize the situation, you say the word. Now understand something. You have every right in the world to be against that policy. That's fine. But when it becomes misleading to the point of lying is when you try to pretend by splicing it out of context and putting it back to back to back to back to back. You try to pretend or at least imply that this is Joe Rogan a vicious bigot who's just calling people the N-word. I think that's incredibly misleading. Super misleading. Now, again, I want to reiterate, if you're against that policy, that's totally fine. Joe said, I stopped doing it. If I was quoting a comedy bit, I stopped doing that because I realized it's probably not the best idea to do that. It's probably not the best idea to say that. And I now agree that probably under no context should a white person say that word. He changed his policy. The Young Turks years ago changed their policy. I years ago changed my policy. But if you were to try to be a dishonest smear merchant, you could go back and dig up Secular Talk clips where I say it 3 or 4 times on air because I'm quoting directly from a story where somebody said it. But the thing that is infuriating is that now this is having a tremendous impact on normies. So what I mean by that is people who know nothing about Joe Rogan are now thinking, oh, Joe, like every episode of Joe Rogan is anti-vax claptrap and racism. And so, my mom texted me. My neighbor texted me talking about, oh, Joe Rogan's in hot water. Joe Rogan did this. Joe Rogan did that. And I'm not blaming them because this is just the impression that they're getting from mainstream media. They can't help it. Their narrative is being shaped for them. And it's always people who've never really watched the podcast who come away now thinking it's just like, he's like Rush Limbaugh doing interviews or something. And that's just not accurate. And that's just not fair. Now, I'm not saying you can't have criticisms of Joe Rogan. I have many criticisms of Joe Rogan. Him and I have argued some of our criticisms on air, like when we debated Medicare for All. But it really is at the point where there's just a bunch of lying going on about him. And look, the smear campaign is working. So in response to this, now this is where it really takes a bizarre turn. So at the same time that this scandal's going on, Spotify removed, as of the recording of this right now, Spotify has removed 113 episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience. Now, the normie perception of this, and the perception, even CNN, they said this on air, and it's not true. The normie perception is, oh, they're just pulling down the episodes where he uses racial slurs. That is not true. There were, I think, 22 times in the supercut where he said the word, and there are 113 episodes that were pulled. You do the math. Now, another misperception is some people might think, well, they're only really taking down the obviously extreme episodes, like, for example, figures like Alex Jones. Maybe he talked about Sandy Hook or something on there, and they don't want to be associated with that. Or Gavin McInnes, the founder of the Proud Boys, or Owen Benjamin, who's now an openly alt-right loser, or this guy Chuck Johnson, this right-wing writer who argued for, literal racism on air, and there are genetic differences or whatever between the races, or Milo Yiannopoulos, who has a whole other bunch of problems, or Stefan Molyneux. But the fact of the matter is, no. You know who else is on that list? Dan Savage is on that list. Mark Maron. Duncan Trussell, a hippie comedian who's to the left of me. TJ Kirk, the amazing atheist, he's on that ban list. Bill Burr is on that ban list. These are all people whose politics, at the very least, lean left. Some of them are pretty far left. And then you know who else is on that list? Yours truly. I made the list. So I've been on Joe Rogan's show 5 times. 4 of those episodes are still up, at least for now. We'll see what happens as time moves on. But the late 2018 appearance that I did on Joe Rogan's show, after I was at Politicon, and I did some debates, and I was on some panels with some Daily Wire people, and I aggressively questioned Chris Christie, and there was a clip that I debuted on Rogan's show that was that. They pulled down that episode. So the episode number is 1187, and I was trying to figure out, Crystal and I were talking about this for a while, trying to figure out, why on earth did they ban it? How could they ban that? Why would they ban that? What exactly was said in the podcast? Now, thankfully, so there's bits and pieces that are still up on YouTube. By the way, thank you. Credit to YouTube for being less censorious, at least on this front. And there's also some other random podcasting outlets that still have it up. So I went back and I listened to the podcast. So here are some of the things we talked about. We, ironically enough, talked about a social media purge that had just happened right before I went on the podcast. There was the Free Thought Project was banned, I think, on Facebook, and then you had Police the Police, which is like a police accountability group that was banned, and there was a whole bunch of like anti-war outlets that were banned. So we talked about that, and we talked about the slippery slope and the problem with that. And by the way, in the context of that conversation, one of the points I make was Alex Jones was just the tip of the spear. You know, he was like the test case, and nobody likes Alex Jones in polite society. So after he's gone, well, next thing you know, you just open the door, and all of a sudden you're going down to who? Me getting banned, and whoa, would you look at that? So we talked about that. We talked about legalizing marijuana. We talked about the drug war and drug cartels in Mexico. We talked about how the Dem Party needs to be reformed, and I went into detail about what I think Democrats need to do. I went after Donald Trump pretty aggressively, praised Bernie Sanders. Joe made a point about how the men's rights activists have a point with certain issues like custody of kids. But the big one, so I'm down to two things that I think it may be as to why it was banned. One of them was when we talked about legalizing marijuana, and when I showed the clip of me questioning Chris Christie aggressively on marijuana policy, Joe makes an argument about, look, Chris Christie wants to ban drugs, which other people, can be addicted to. But clearly, he has an addiction problem of his own. He's addicted to food. And his addiction is arguably more unhealthy than some sort of marijuana addiction or some other kind of drug addiction. But, freedom is like you get to decide what to put in your own body as long as you're not hurting anybody else. And nobody's coming to crack down on him for his addiction, so it's so hypocritical for him to go after other people for their addiction. Now, I guess you can make a stretch of an argument that they say, oh, this is like fat shaming, and we don't allow that on here, so we're going to get rid of that. Maybe that's it, but I think we figured it out. I think in my conversations with Crystal and reading as much as we could about this, we cracked the code and we figured it out. There's a section where we talk about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and I give all the relevant details about it that were in the news at the time. And then I really go in hard after Saudi Arabia. And, I just talk about how they're doing a genocide in Yemen, and they're bombing mosques and open-air markets, and, massacring civilians, and blockading the country, and not allowing food in, and there's starvation, there's famine, there's a cholera epidemic. They're not allowing medicine in. So I really go in hard after Saudi Arabia. And then come to find out, it was just reported by Reuters and the New York Post that very recently, Spotify made a deal to expand into Saudi Arabia. It's the beginning of podcasting in Saudi Arabia where they're allowing it. They expanded into Egypt, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. Now, I don't know if you guys know about how these things work internationally, but you don't just go into a country like Saudi Arabia willy-nilly and free of your own volition and say, we want to have our platform there. No, you need approval, son. You need approval from the Saudi government in order to get your product in Saudi Arabia because it's an authoritarian theocracy. And so, without a doubt, there's no doubt that Spotify had conversations with the Saudi government. And I also have no doubt that Saudi Arabia had terms for the deal. Hey, you want to come in here? That's fine. Here are the ground rules. Here's some things that are no-go zones that we don't like being talked about if you're going to be allowed in this country. There's really no criticism, certainly no vociferous criticism of our government if your platform is going to come in here. Now, look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe it happened to align with the expansion into Saudi Arabia, and the podcast where I criticize Saudi Arabia viciously gets pulled down. Maybe it was a mistake and my podcast was accidentally pulled down and it wasn't supposed to be pulled down. Maybe eventually it'll be brought back up. I don't know. But we're not getting any answers. And Spotify needs to release a statement on this and explain why my podcast and Duncan Trussell and Bill Burr and TJ Kirk and a bunch of lefties were banned. It's not because he said racial slurs in the episode. He didn't say any racial slurs in the episode. There's a transcript of the podcast. Now, admittedly, it's a bad transcript because it's like AI generated and it's like a lot of stuff is off. But I know for sure there was no use of any racial slurs. I was there. And I think I would remember such a thing. So, but there's another angle to this too, which is there's some reporting now that perhaps during this firestorm, it was Rogan who gave the green light to Spotify. Like, okay, look, if you got to pull some podcasts down, you go ahead and pull some podcasts down. Because he's been going through it. I mean, the entire world has turned on him and the media has been going after him relentlessly. And so in the midst of that, it's possible Spotify went to him and they had conversations about the things he said and whatnot. And they said, look, to protect you, we need to, take down maybe some of the podcasts where stuff went a little too far. and we don't want to do it, but it's something that we kind of have to do, or else they're going to keep coming after you. And so we really want to do this to protect you. And it's conceivable. Again, some reporting says Joe was like, okay, if you got to do it, you got to do it. But again, who came up with that list? How was that list derived? Who made the decisions? And how the hell did we get on that list? I think I know the answer because I just laid it out for you in detail. But look, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I want somebody to lay it out there for me and explain to me why I'm wrong and how I'm wrong. And the criticism, the only criticism here of Joe that I think is fair is that he's a really honest person and he assumes good intent in even the critics that are coming after him. But he put out that first apology video thinking it would like satiate everybody and everything, and everybody go, oh, that's reasonable enough, fair enough. Now, some people said that, like the women on The View were like, okay, we'll see what happens. But the rest of mainstream media was not satiated, and the people who are against him were not satiated. And in fact, the opposite happened. They smelled blood in the water, and they went for the jugular, and they went in for the kill. And then they kept digging up all the, whatever old stuff. And by the way, more of it's going to come. They're just going to they're going to look through every little nook and cranny of that show and find the things that are most questionable, and they're going to build giant campaigns around it. So if there was any real concern here, Joe could have just done the thing that he said he was going to do without issuing an apology video. Like, he could have just brought on more pro-vaccine people. That would have been great. He could have just prepped more so that he could, push back on the controversial guests who were saying things that could be dead wrong. But he's an honest person, so he thought, I'll put this out and then it'll all work out. And clearly, that did not work out very well. But really, I think the original sin was just going to Spotify in the first place. Because, look, he was more independent before he went to Spotify. Look, he was on YouTube. You're not fully independent on YouTube, and we know that because even though I have zero relationship with anybody at the top of YouTube, right, the CEO or whatever, there is more independence there. Now, they could drop the censorship hammer on me at any time, and the algorithm screws me as it does, and all that stuff, but there was more nominal independence where he would just sort of put out whatever. When he made the deal with Spotify, he became the face of Spotify, and they paid him a tremendous amount of money to be more exclusive on their platform. And taking that deal meant that if something like this was going to happen, maybe he wasn't in a position where he could puff his chest out and say, fuck off, we're not pulling any of our episodes down. And so I think the original sin was going to Spotify in the first place. If I was close enough with Joe at the time and he asked my opinion, I would have said, don't do it. Don't go to Spotify. You're better off more independent. The more independence you can get, the better you are. And even though, now he has small country money and FU money, it's not like before he wasn't phenomenally wealthy. He was still pulling in millions a year before. And I would have said, that's enough. You don't want to take way more money than that, but also potentially lose your independence. And now it looks like they're cracking down on his independence. So that would be my criticisms of Joe in the conversation. Now, what's the end game here? Because that's the other conversation. What is the end game here? And I think the answer is the media wants Joe gone. And there's a lot of people who genuinely want him taken down off of Spotify. Now, even if he is taken down off Spotify, he'll go to some other platform or create his own platform. And I don't agree with other people when they say, hey, his audience will get bigger if that happens. I actually don't agree with that. They're sufficiently demonizing him, and the campaign is so aggressive that it is working to some extent. And I think what would happen is he'd lose like 10 or 15% of his audience and be on a new platform, and he'd be fine. But the media, I don't think they want him on any platform. And we can't get through this conversation without bringing up the immense hypocrisy of mainstream media, because these are the people who sold us Russiagate, which turned out to be totally false. There were many lies told around Russiagate. There was never a reckoning for that. The people who spread the misinformation, never were fired from being on air or suspended or whatever. They sold us the Iraq War. I mean, that was a lie that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians and led to torture. And the people who pushed the Iraq War ended up getting promoted. The people who were against the war were the ones who lost their platform, like Jesse Ventura, like Phil Donahue, and others. It was mainstream media that sold us this financial crisis. They pretended like, no, it's okay. There's not going to be a crash. And then there was a giant crash. They were giving investing advice saying, no, keep investing and you're going to be fine. And then everything went belly up. These are the outlets that sold us the whole Jussie Smollett thing. I saw that story. I'm a lefty. I didn't touch it with a 10-foot pole because I thought that seems fishy. They went all in on that. That was misinformation. There was never any accountability over that. CNN just went through the whole Andrew Cuomo scandal where they were, fluffing him up on air and treating him like a hero at the same time he signed an order to get COVID-positive patients back into nursing homes, which led to countless deaths. I mean, the list goes on and on. I could sit here all day and do this. Joyanne Reid was caught with very homophobic old blog posts, and she said, I was hacked, and somebody put it in there. Hacked? It was in the Wayback Machine. It was archived. What are there, time-traveling hackers? There was no accountability for that. NBC just hired a guy by the name of Stephen Hayes. Stephen Hayes wrote the book saying that Saddam Hussein worked with Al-Qaeda, and that's why we need to do the Iraq War. That is a total lie, based on no evidence. Homeboy wrote a book on it, and he just got hired by NBC. These are deep purveyors of misinformation. Deep purveyors of it. Even on the issue of COVID, early on, Dr. Fauci said, hey, masks don't work at all. Don't wear a mask. Well, come to find out, that's not true. N95 masks work 95 to 99% of the time. A KN95 mask work pretty well, too. Cloth masks don't work as well. They only stop 37% of particulate matter, according to a study that came out of Bangladesh. But he said masks don't work and don't wear a mask. And then very soon thereafter, it was viewed as a fact that you should wear a mask and it'll help protect you from COVID-19. They laughed at the idea of the lab leak theory and called it a conspiracy. Come to find out, that is possible, if not likely, as to how COVID spread. So even on the topic that they go after him for, they spread misinformation just as bad, if not worse. So they want him gone. And the point here is to make Joe super toxic to normie Americans and more apolitical people and people who don't already watch him. And effectively, this has the chilling effect of maybe forcing him to censor himself, because now he's going to walk on eggshells knowing that everybody's going to parse through every single specific thing that he says. And it's an attempt to make the show not what it's supposed to be. And then the other thing is, what's going to happen? Is there ever going to be the next Joe Rogan? The next, podcaster who's really doing their own thing and having these broad conversations? First of all, no company's going to touch somebody like that with a 10-foot pole, and you'd have to be crazy to be open and uncensored like that, because eventually the hammer's going to drop on you. So it has a chilling effect on Discord. So, on discourse, excuse me. So, there you have it. That's what's going on right now with Joe Rogan. That's the entire scandal. And, look, man, I was censored. My podcast from late 2018 was banned. I'm not okay with that. And this is what happens with censorship. It might start with a target that you're like, I could sort of see it. But that's the slippery slope of all time. And people who are really on the left, who are actually on the left, the censorship will always come for you. Why? Because part and parcel of leftism, part of the very definition of leftism, is that you want to change the status quo, no longer do business as usual, and go after powerful institutions and reform them and restructure them. So it was probably because I went after Saudi Arabia. Now what? You can't criticize Saudi Arabia. I notice this on my channel. When I criticize Saudi Arabia, videos usually demonetized. Criticize Israel, videos usually demonetized. Talk about Syria, videos usually demonetized. And the list goes on and on. There's going to come a time where the people with all the money and all the power, will they even tolerate somebody like me ruthlessly going after the health insurance companies, where I call them parasitic mafia middlemen who are price gouging Americans and provide no value whatsoever? Well, they have all the money. They can buy ads. They can control these corporations. So my guess is eventually even criticism like that will not be allowed. So if you're interested in changing society for the better and holding these institutions accountable, I suggest you oppose censorship, because you know what? It's a package deal. Like I said, some of these characters are totally odious. Some of these characters, I'd argue with them until I'm blue in the face about how they're wrong about everything, whether it's that Chuck Johnson guy who's openly racist, or Stefan Molyneux, or Owen Benjamin, or whoever. But it's a package deal. So if they go, guess what? Then your favorite leftist is going to go too. And we're already seeing it in real time. So this is exactly what we've been warning about every step of the way, and it's here. It's here. So I will try my best. What I'm going to do is try my best to find all the bits and pieces of that podcast, and I will post them on my channel, on Secular Talk, on this channel. YouTube, at least at this point, hasn't banned them. The whole episode is not on YouTube. Bits and pieces are on YouTube. I'll try to post those videos. I'll try to get the whole audio and post that here as well. And then also, I'm going to save the other podcasts I did with Joe, all 5 appearances, because who knows when the next one's going to get taken down. Who knows? So there you have it. Don't miss the macro conversation here, because you could get bogged down in the particulars and the specifics and go into that N-word conversation and never find your way out. But the fact of the matter is, clearly, this is more than that, because it was 113 podcasts that were banned, including ones that had no racially insensitive stuff at all. So everybody needs to be having that conversation. I don't care if you like or dislike Joe Rogan. I don't care. Guess what? Nobody cares. Nobody cares. What I care about is what's now going to happen as a result of this ruthless campaign against him, and now Spotify pulling down 113 episodes and counting, by the way, and counting. So we're already very far down that slippery slope, and if you don't see it, you just don't want to see it. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.